History loves a clean ending. A villain defeated, a conscience awakened, chains falling because the world suddenly remembered how to care. That is the version we are taught. Comfortable, reassuring, a moral sunrise after a long night. But history is rarely moved by virtue alone. It moves when systems stop paying their rent, when the math no longer works, when profit changes sides. So tonight we ask a harder question, not whether slavery was wrong, but why it actually ended. Was it the triumph of morality, or the collapse of an economic engine that had outlived its usefulness? The answer unsettles both camps. For centuries, slavery was not treated as a moral contradiction. It was treated as architecture. It was a system engineered to move wealth, secure labor, and concentrate power with ruthless efficiency. Kingdoms, empires, and republics did not merely tolerate slavery, they planned around it. Entire ports were designed to service it. Shipping routes were optimized for it. Laws were written to protect it. Financial instruments were created to ensure it. Human beings were priced, depreciated, mortgaged, and inherited like farmland or machinery. Slavery was not operating in the shadows of history. It was printed plainly in ledgers, court documents, and government budgets. By the 18th century, the Atlantic slave trade had matured into one of the most sophisticated commercial networks on Earth. European manufacturers exported guns, textiles, and metal goods to Africa. Those goods were exchanged for people. Those people were shipped across the Atlantic under conditions designed not for survival, but for maximum profit per voyage. In the Americas, they were sold into forced labor producing sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. Those commodities flowed back to Europe, fueling consumption, taxation, and industrial growth. Every stage of the process generated revenue. Every delay was optimized away. Even death was accounted for as expected loss. Slavery did not survive because people failed to notice its cruelty. It survived because it was profitable on a scale few other systems could match. Which leads to a deeply uncomfortable realization. If slavery were simply immoral and obviously unsustainable, it should have collapsed under its own weight long before the modern era. Instead, it expanded. It professionalized. It globalized. Something did not end slavery by exposing its cruelty. Something had to make it stop working. The popular story of abolition often begins with conscience, with pamphlets passed hand to hand, with sermons delivered from pulpits, with poems, speeches, and personal testimonies that finally forced society to see enslaved people as fully human. Those voices mattered. They shaped language. They mobilized movements. They applied pressure where silence had once lived. To deny their importance would be dishonest. But moral outrage alone does not dismantle systems that generate enormous wealth. It rarely ever has. History is full of evils that were widely acknowledged as wrong, and yet continued for centuries because they paid too well to abandon. For every abolitionist argument, there were investors running numbers. For every moral appeal, there were shipping manifests and crop yields, proving that slavery still delivered returns. Moral arguments can challenge legitimacy, but they struggle to overcome incentive. If morality were sufficient, slavery would have ended the moment it was named a sin, the moment philosophers condemned it, the moment religious authorities questioned it. Instead, those condemnations coexisted comfortably with expansion. Slavery was criticized and defended at the same time, often by the same institutions. This timing matters. Slavery did not end at the height of moral clarity. It ended when moral pressure aligned with something far more decisive, a changing economic reality. The most serious threat slavery ever faced did not arrive with a sermon. It arrived with a machine. The Industrial Revolution restructured the global economy in ways plantation systems could not easily adapt to. Factories required concentrated labor, standardized schedules, and workers who could be trained, replaced, and relocated quickly. Permanent ownership of human beings became a liability rather than an advantage. Steam power reduced reliance on raw human muscle. Mechanization narrowed the productivity gap between free and forced labor. Urban industry rewarded flexibility, specialization, and consumption. Enslaved people could not legally move, purchase goods freely, or participate in consumer markets. Wage laborers could. From a purely economic standpoint, free labor proved more efficient. Not more humane, more adaptable. Employers could extract value without providing lifelong maintenance. Workers could be discarded during downturns without legal responsibility. Capital could flow where returns were highest instead of being locked into land and bodies. Slavery tied wealth to geography and inheritance. Industrial capitalism wanted speed, liquidity, and scalability. The old system was rigid. The new one was modular. Slavery was no longer the future. It was in the way of it. Britain is often celebrated as the moral pioneer of abolition. The slave trade was banned in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished across the empire in 1833. The narrative is typically framed as a triumph of conscience over cruelty. But by the time abolition arrived, Britain's economic center of gravity had already shifted. Wealth increasingly flowed from factories, finance, and global trade rather than sugar plantations. Industrial output had begun to eclipse colonial extraction as the engine of national power. Ending slavery also weakened rival economies still dependent on plantation labor. It disrupted competitors while costing Britain comparatively little. Abolition, in this context, was not just ethical, it was strategic. One detail exposes the underlying priorities. When slavery was abolished, the British government compensated slave owners for their losses. The enslaved received nothing. The largest government payout in British history was not for justice, but for property claims. Morality may have provided the language. Economics wrote the check. In the United States, slavery did not fade away. It detonated. The Southern economy was deeply entangled with human ownership. Cotton dominated global markets. Enslaved people were used as financial collateral. Political power was structured around their existence. Slavery was not a regional quirk. It was a national economic pillar. The Civil War did not begin as a crusade for emancipation. It began as a fight to preserve the Union. Emancipation emerged later when it became strategically useful. Freeing enslaved people weakened the Confederate economy, disrupted labor, and opened a new pool of soldiers for the Union Army. Freedom arrived not as a moral epiphany, but as a wartime calculation, necessary, effective, delayed as long as possible. If slavery had ended primarily for moral reasons, its aftermath would look radically different. Instead, freedom arrived without land, without capital, and without protection. Formerly enslaved people were released into an economy designed to exploit their vulnerability. Sharecropping replaced plantations. Debt replaced chains. Segregation replaced ownership. The labor system changed. The hierarchy endured. This continuity reveals the true objective. The goal was not justice. It was reorganization, a shift from ownership to control, from bondage enforced by law to dependence enforced by economics. Slavery ended when it stopped being the most efficient system for extracting labor and wealth. Moral pressure mattered. Abolitionist movements mattered. Enslaved people, resisting, escaping, sabotaging, and surviving, mattered most of all. But the decisive force was economic transformation. Industrial capitalism offered a new model, one that preserved inequality while shedding responsibility, one that could exploit labor without owning it. Slavery was not defeated in a moral duel. It was outcompeted. We prefer moral endings. They allow us to believe progress is inevitable, that injustice collapses once exposed to the light. Economic endings are harder to live with. They suggest cruelty often persists until it becomes inefficient, that systems rarely change because they are wrong, but because they are no longer optimal. That realization should unsettle us, because it means morality alone is rarely enough to end injustice. It also offers clarity. Power moves when incentives change. Reform succeeds when systems stop paying their way. Slavery did not end because humanity suddenly became good. It ended because the world discovered a cheaper, more flexible way to extract value. Understanding that does not diminish the horror of slavery. It sharpens our awareness of how injustice survives. Because the next great wrong will not disappear with a speech either. it will end when the math breaks. And history suggests we should be paying close attention to the numbers.